it's my task to throw some food for thought about the Sermon on the Mount that you are going to now take back and discuss. And to try and do this, in a sense, with the mimetic theory in mind, because that's what we're here for. I have a whole section on the Sermon on the Mount in my book, The Jesus-Driven Life, and I was tempted to just bring the DVD in and turn it on and you could just watch that, and then I wouldn't have to stand here. Okay, so it's the real thing. What I want to suggest to you tonight has to do with the way the sermon's typically been interpreted in the past. The Sermon on the Mount is one of those texts that, depending on your particular tradition, you're going to place a certain value on. For the Anabaptist tradition that I am currently involved in, it plays a strategic hermeneutic role. That is, the Anabaptist tradition will interpret the entire Jesus tradition through the lens of the Sermon on the Mount and the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount. And then from there, we'll interpret the entire Bible through that perspective. Now, I've been intrigued in hanging out with the Anabaptists this last 5 years since we moved to Lancaster County to not only observe this in theory, but in practice. And rather than trying to engage in a critique of the Anabaptist appropriation of this, what I want to draw your attention to is something that I think it's easily missed for us when we tend to read Matthew's text. The first thing that we want to observe is the Sermon on the Mount is a compilation of the Jesus tradition. It is not an actual sermon. You know this. You know that, in fact, it's loaded with Matheme redactions. So much so that when scholars sit down and they look at the Sermon on the Mount, they will do very creative things seeking to find a structure for this text. So, for example, and this is just as an example, and you can't see this, I know those of you over there can't see this, but Michael Goulder, in his book, Big Ration Legend in Matthew, argues that the Sermon on the Mount is structured chiastically. What that means is the 8 Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn and weep, etc., are then exegeted backwards from blessed are the persecuted all the way back down to the poor in spirit in the Sermon on the Mount, with 3 examples every time. So when you start the exegesis in 5:11 through 12, blessed are the persecuted, the 3 particular exegeses of what it means to be persecuted are your rewards in heaven, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the cosmos, and that's why you're persecuted. The next beatitude to be exegeted, blessed are the peacemakers, is exegeted by saying, a peacemaker is not angry, rude, or insulting. They seek to be reconciling. They come to terms with their enemy. And so on down through this. So you have the structure in the sermon, from Goulder's perspective, that the actual sermon itself is just an exegesis of the Beatitudes in reverse. Ulrich Lutz and other scholars will say, yes, the sermon has a chiastic structure, but the center of this particular text is the Lord's Prayer. And so you could go look at all these folks, and they make very, very good cases, but even though they disagree on how it's structured, they all admit that it has a structure. Now, why is that important? Because there are only 2 parallels to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount in early Christian literature. One is found in Luke 6. That's the Sermon on the Plain. And so scholars will say, oh, gee, we've got material in Luke 6 that parallels what we've got in the Sermon on the Mount. So that common material comes from, guess what? Q. And what's Q stand for? And Quella means? Source. What source? Who knows? Yes. So this is all Q material. Well, when you said that, that's not helpful. So what? But there is a third source. where we find an awful lot of the Sermon on the Mount parallel. And that's a little book called the Didache. The Didache is a document. Some scholars will date as early as 50. Think of this. 50. Paul has just started his letter-writing career. There are no Gospels yet. But there is a tradition, like the Sermon on the Mount, already circulating in 50. Even if it's not written down yet, it's an oral tradition that is structured. Some will date it as late as 120. Didache research now is placing the oral tradition of the Didache as a structured oral tradition as early as 70. That is prior to the formation of the Gospels. Why is this important? Aaron Milovich, and the Didache, by the way, is only 13, 14 short chapters. He's written a 1,000-page commentary. Where do these guys write? Brian, you need to write some big fat books for us, 1,000 pages. But on the Didache, but one of the things that he makes what I think is an almost airtight case for is that the Didache, the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, which are all structured discourse material, ethical material, are in fact early Christian catechism. That is, they are texts that were catechism. Not kitty cat. Catechism. They are texts that are intended to be memorized in the exact order they're given. Now, how many of you grew up having a catechism, growing up with a catechism? Yeah? What is the purpose of catechetical instruction? John Hill.
I didn't grow up with one.
No, but you wrote about it. I got your essay on my website.
I wrote about catechesis, but not catechism.
Okay, but what's the purpose again? Formation. Formation of disciples. That's right. This formation of the type of person that one is in the community. Or in other words, catechesis is about what Renee would term positive mimesis. In catechesis, what we are given is the character of Jesus in ethical form. That's what we're given in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus lived this stuff. He didn't ask you to do anything that he hadn't already done. So it's interesting that as soon, again, and this is in the post-Constantinian church, as soon as the church capitulates to the use of any kind of force, coercion, or violence, the first thing to go is the Sermon on the Mount. In reality, a lot of the early church was no different than Richard Niebuhr, who would argue that the Sermon on the Mount is unrealistic. It doesn't work in this world. But the fact is, if we are dealing here with catechetical instruction, if we are dealing with character formation, what we are given here in this text is precisely the type of person we are to become in the new community. And what type of person is that? Blessed are the broken, the poor, the bankrupt in their spirituality. Those who, when they look to God, remember we're thinking ancient now, ancient old world, God is up. Those who, when they look to God, recognize they don't have much. It's a far cry from an awful lot of spirituality that's found in the Western church tradition and the church today. Blessed are those who weep. And again, the exegesis of the text, if you follow Goulder, isn't just about personal sin. It's about the brokenness of the world around. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for right relationships. I am one of those that is not satisfied by translating dikaiosune with the English term justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Righteousness doesn't work either. Righteousness sounds too moralistic. The problem with justice is that justice is often nothing more than the victim doing to the persecutor what the persecutor did to the victim. Tit for tat, lex talionis, this kind of thing. Or, in the words of Pete Townsend, meet the new boss. Same as the old boss. And so as you move through this is who, the sermon is who Jesus is. It's a call to discipleship. So that's the first thing I want to suggest to you. The sermon is how to be like Jesus. It's a call to formation. It's a call to positive witnesses. That's the first thing. That's the purpose of the structure. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 says, "No one knows a father like a son, or a son like a father, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal who the Father is." Well, that sounds very Johannine, but immediately following that, Jesus says, "Come unto me, you who are burdened and heavy laden. I will give you rest." And then what does he say? "Take my yoke." Now, that is a phrase that would resonate with any Jewish hearer. Because a rabbinic expression, an expression that's found not simply in the Mishnah, but also before that in some of the pseudepigrapha, it's also found in some of the later apocryphal literature, like Ben Sirach or Ecclesiasticus. Some of you may know it as that book. The yoke is Torah. The yoke is the law, the commandments, the do's and the don'ts. And so the rabbis, or the pre-rabbinic Pharisee tradition, will talk about taking on the yoke of the Torah. We live in Amish country now, which we absolutely love. And my office window overlooks an Amish farm. And every spring through fall, I get to watch that farmer yoke his mules together, plow the fields, and do all the things that Amish farmers do with yoked oxen in farming. I'm not a farmer, so I mean, you know. But what they do is they take a mature mule, and if they have a younger mule, they'll pair that younger mule with a mature mule who knows the fields. And that mature mule then goes along and does exactly what the farmer does because he's done it so many times before, year in and year out. And guess what that younger mule does? The younger mule says, "I don't want to go that way. I don't want to go that way." And every time that younger mule doesn't want to go the way the farmer wants the older mule to go, what happens to the younger mule inside the yoke? When you're yoked, when Amish are yoked, no, the younger ones, I mean, they're not rebellious like we are, but the yoke carries them along. This is Matthew's image for discipleship. We are yoked with Jesus. We're not yoked to a set of prohibitions or rituals. We're not yoked to a law. We are yoked to a person. This person, from Matthew's perspective, is the one who not only existed in history, but in the words of Matthew 28:20, is the one who is with the community to the end of the age. It is the present Christ, the Christus presens, to use that wonderful Latin phrase. Present Christ. It is Jesus with whom we are yoked. It is Jesus who we are called to follow. It is Jesus who we imitate. Not in a slavish medieval fashion, like you might find, for example, in Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, where Jesus did this, then we do this. It's not some kind of a cheap version of what would Jesus do. It is being yoked to the living Lord who in each and every situation will teach you what it means to be poor in spirit, to mourn, to be meek, to hunger and thirst, to be merciful. Not with a set of here's how to live the successful Christian life and all the do's and all the don'ts. It means there's an intentionality about the relationship. Remember, before the yoke saying is the saying about the father-son relationship. Discipleship is not about chafing at the bit. Discipleship is precisely about being related to the living God. This is where the notion of positive mimesis can play such a key role in the formation of disciples in the Christian community today. That's the second point. The last point I want to make about the sermon is this. Most of what is found in the Sermon on the Mount can be paralleled from the Jewish midrashim, that's the plural, from the Jewish midrashim and from the Targumim. Do you all know what midrash and Targum are? Everybody? Yeah. Okay. Midrashim are the way the rabbis would take any given text of the Hebrew Bible and, I'll use the word expand it a bit. Okay? So, for example, one of the more interesting midrashim in the book of Genesis can be found in the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain is a Sadducee, Abel is a Pharisee, and of course, the story is told from the perspective of who? The Pharisee who's getting beaten up by the Sadducee. But you also find the same kind of thing going on in the Targums. Now, we mentioned earlier this business about the end of chapter 5. So when you look at the sheer amount of material that gets exegeted in chapter 5, you have heard it said, but I am now telling you something else. You've heard it said, but I'm telling you something new, something different. One of the things that we need to recognize is that at the end of this whole section of the kind of newness of the logic that's going on in chapter 5, you've heard it said, but I say to you, is Matthew's coming back and saying, therefore be teleos as your Father in heaven is teleos. And so Adam earlier said, this is mistranslated in the King James and other versions as perfect. Well, telos in Greek can mean end, it can mean goal, it can mean the perfection of something. It can mean these things. But Jesus, more than likely, did not give this kind of material out in Greek language. He gave it in Aramaic. So it is interesting, is it not, that in Luke's version of this material, it's be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Does the Sermon on the Mount say anything about mercy? Blessed are the merciful. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. Right? But it's important to know that the Jewish Targums in Leviticus have this also, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Jesus didn't just make this stuff up out of thin air. He cherry-picked his culture. He cherry-picked what worked for him in terms of who he understood his God to be. What you do not find anywhere in Judaism paralleled in the Sermon on the Mount is this business to love the enemy. You just don't find it. There's no parallel to it. That's why what Tony said earlier is so very, very important. And how mimetic theory helps us see this. We are given an opportunity here to recognize that in following Jesus and being yoked with Jesus, to be perfect is to be able to live in relation with others the same way God lives in relation to us. Now there's a text in Romans, I think, that reflects this logic. Romans chapter 5. Paul says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And he will then go on to say, I will quote the text because now, being this time of night, if you're brain dead as I am, there's no way I'm going to be able to quote this correctly. Verse 10 of Romans 5. For if, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Well, you know, if I was a fundamentalist preacher, I would start going on and on and on about how we were God's enemies. God viewed us as the enemy. But what if, in fact, the text is not saying that God views us as enemies, but that we view God as the enemy? Or if, when we considered God to be the enemy, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through this life? That kind of logic is precisely the ethics that we find in the Sermon on the Mount. You with me on this? Okay. So these three things I would suggest to you. One, the sermon is an early Christian catechism. It's a Jewish catechism. By the way, the book of James is the only book in the New Testament that reflects this catechetical material. There's a ton of the Sermon on the Mount in the book of James. The book of James is a synagogue reflection on this kind of catechetical material. Two, we are dealing here not with the medieval notion of the imitation of Christ or a cheap version of what would Jesus do, but a living relationship where we are yoked with, well, the word Jesus, the living word. And then finally, three, we are invited to recognize that what is really unique in this text, what really is radical, is this extraordinary, as Tony calls it, the abyssal compassion, this abyssal love, this love that knows no limit, that knows no enemy, that has no enemy other. No one is the enemy. With those three things, you will be invited to reflect on. I have no idea if the questions that I did for the study relate to the material. Now, having said that, I have one other announcement. Very important. How many of you were here at Theology Piece last year? Remember yet? Okay. You'll remember on Tuesday night last year, Jim Warren put on his black coat and came in and absolutely blew our minds. Yes?
Yes.
Jim is a professional magician. Jim has performed before Hollywood celebrities. Jim is nothing short of an absolute phenomenon when it comes to magic. Tonight, around 8:45-ish, on the second floor of Alicia, at our happy hour, Jim is going to perform magic tricks. But they're not your ordinary run-of-the-mill magic tricks. Some of them are Sherrodian magic tricks. What I mean by this is, Jim has taken all of his broad and deep learning of the mimetic theory, and he's looked at his repertoire of magic tricks and said, oh, there's an analog here, there's an analog here. I could use this to illustrate that. I could use this to show that. I guarantee you, you will have your world rock tonight in a first-class, prime-time event. Now, I'm going to be a little self-promoting here. We brought Jim to Lancaster, Pennsylvania this year, and we asked Jim to do a one-day seminar using magic and talking about the mimetic theory, which he did, which we filmed. You see, we film everything. And we are turning that into a DVD for instruction in the church. How fun! Your congregation gets to watch a professional magician exegete the biblical text and blow their minds with magic. And they'll say to you, oh, that's just the camera. Tonight, you will be able to say, I saw that trick live. So, you got the elephant ready? And
I have the elephant, but I didn't bring the glass.
Jim is what's known as a close-up magician. He doesn't do the David Copperfield stuff. But what he can do with a deck of cards, I guarantee you, you do not want to miss this thing. It is nothing short, well, next to dropping a hit of acid. It'll blow your mind. So be there tonight to see Jim, and keep an eye out on our website for the DVD. And thank you. You've all been wonderful. We love you very much.